I mean, when Zambia's Minister of Finance was appointed in 2021, his first thing was, first couple of words that came out of his mouth after saying thank you to the president for the appointment was, we are now going to engage the IMF. It's like, what, this guy? What about engage your people? What about engage your people, man? What about engage the union? I don't think that's the kind of development that we should strive for. We should strive for a kind of development where, what are examples of development that is not emancipatory, and they'll never, why would they manage you for your own benefit? This is bizarre. Somebody will manage you for their benefit. About, at the end of the day, colonialism and imperialism is about economics. It's not about politics. It's about economics. In many ways, that book led to him being overthrown in 1966.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us again today. Today with me, I'm about to have a very interesting conversation with someone I have followed for a very long time, Professor Grieve Chelwa. He's an associate professor at the Africa Institute, and he majors in political economy. You've obviously seen his work before, if you've been following African economics in the past few years, especially with the interest in Zambia and with the debt restructuring. And today's conversation is something I've wanted to have a conversation with him for a long time. And it's basically this question of, do we, as the African continent, need development? I think everybody agrees the answer is yes. But then the question is, what kind of development do we need? And we'll try and zoom into the question of debt as we get into the conversation and get into the nitty-gritties of the G20's common framework. And as well as at the end, we'll come and try and round it up with some great solutions that he has. So just kind of like to begin it off, we agree we all need development, but what kind of development do you think the continent needs?
Sam, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. We've sort of known about each other, but I don't think we've ever seen each other until last week when we had sort of a conversation online. Thanks for that question. I think you're right. It is always important to define terms and to be sure that we're all very clear about what we are striving for. And I think everybody in Africa and everybody outside of Africa wants Africa to develop. I mean, if you read the documents from the International Monetary Fund or from the World Bank or from the UN or from the African Union, from African governments, everybody's talking about the target is development, right? But what kind of development are they striving for? And I think this is where we ourselves need to be able to articulate, we as Africans need to be able to be clear about the kind of development that we are striving for. In some of my most recent work, I have been sort of thinking about development in emancipatory terms. I think development development happens when a people can fully realize self-determination. They can fully determine for themselves the direction of their societies, right? And I think that is the kind of development that we hope happens in Africa. You could have the reverse. You could have a kind of development where there's some change in the material conditions of people, right? But then they become ever more subservient or ever more reliant on others, or ever more, they become really the lackeys of others in the rest of the world. I don't think that's the kind of development that we should strive for. We should strive for a kind of development where our people, our countries can fully determine their own trajectories. They can stand for themselves on the global stage. They can emerge as a global power on the global stage and assert themselves on the global stage. And I hope that's the kind of development that our African governments are talking about when they're, but I don't see that kind of clarity. I don't see that kind of clarity. I think often the development discourse ends at things like, oh, we're going to raise the living standards of our people, which is important and desirable. We're going to reduce poverty, which is important and desirable. We're going to reduce inequality, which is important and desirable. We're going to reduce and eliminate gender disparities, all types of societal disparities, which are all desirable. Those should be preconditions, should be necessary conditions. But a sufficient condition, I think, is that this kind of development should lead us towards full emancipation. We should really be able to stand on our own feet and assert ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's very basic once you say it out loud that we all agree that we need to have development, but
Yeah.
we need to have development that's leading somewhere and not putting us into this same rat race of trying to dig ourselves out of the same holes that we've been digging ourselves out of. But also on that, and again, even for me, it was surprising to learn
Yeah.
about the history of it. And unfortunately, a lot of things on the continent keep going back to colonialism, and the idea that colonial powers took out loans on sovereigns of African states that had to be paid after they got independence. And the key part here was the debts that were taken were for infrastructure development that was extractive, was taking
Yeah.
out resources out instead of developing these countries for the long term. And we saw healthcare, education, housing, even agriculture, which I saw you mentioned in your last Substack, being left out, or at least the system that was set up was not productive for the continent. So it was interesting to see the backstory to where the development goes. But I know you've talked about like neo-colonialism as well. So how does that play a role in our lack of development we've seen in the past decades?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question, by the way, Sam. And I was just going to say, I think I should give, and most people would like to say, what are examples of development that is not emancipatory and development that is emancipatory? I can think of two countries, for example. I'm always struck by South Korea, right? In many ways, most people think it's a developed country, and it is highly industrialized, highly developed, produces high-tech products, is a major producer of cars, a major producer of high-tech technology and all that kind of thing. But for many people see South Korea as somehow being in the orbit of the US, very much, in the orbit of the US. It is not in many ways thought of as a big power. There's some, obviously, it has some relative room of self-determination vis-a-vis some of our African countries. And then you have China. Next step, right? I mean, China is a big power, a real big power, and you can see right now, the tariffs and counter tariffs and the joking between the U.S. and China. That China really, in many ways, is on the way, if it hasn't already arrived at this idea of emancipatory development that I sort of been toying with in my head. So I'd rather Africa ended up like China, no, not like China, but this has that kind of development, the kind of development that allows you not to be a lackey of anybody else, not to have military bases of anybody else, that kind of thing, which is exactly where China is vis-a-vis South Korea. The question, Sam, about neocolonialism is an interesting one, and I'd like to invite the audience to read one of the most cogent, coherent, theoretical descriptions of neocolonialism was contained in a book, 1965, by Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, called Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And Nkrumah is writing in the tradition of Lenin, right? So Lenin essentially Lenin improves Marxian political economy and sort of casts it in a global type of, essentially Lenin introduced imperialism to Marxian political economy, because Marxian political economy really concerned itself, when Marx was writing, was really thinking about what was happening in Britain, for example, with the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of classes and the class struggle, but he didn't think about capitalism globally, right? And that's what Lenin does. He thinks about it globally, and he thinks about imperialism as vital to the sustenance of capitalism. And then Nkrumah adds on to that and then begins to think about neocolonialism as the last stage of imperialism, which is also advancing capitalism. So essentially what Nkrumah is saying there is almost related to this question of emancipatory development. Nkrumah is basically saying, we have gotten independence, right? So we have gotten rid of formal colonialism, which is the administration of our political affairs and economic affairs formerly by colonial powers, right? We've gotten rid of that formal colonization. Now we're quote unquote independent. It is possible to be independent, but to still be a colony, in the sense that indirectly your affairs are still being managed by others to their advantage. That's the only reason why others will manage you. They'll never, why would they manage you for your own benefit? This is bizarre. Somebody will manage you for their benefit, right? So this is essentially what Nkrumah is saying and defining as neocolonialism: indirect rule, subsequent to the ending of formal direct rule, and indirect rule for their benefit. And essentially, they've given you the flag, they've given you a national anthem, they've given you a name, or they've allowed you to get a flag, to write your national anthem, to name your country. They don't care about those things. What they really care about, at the end of the day, colonialism and imperialism is about economics. It's not about politics, it's about economics. So they don't care about those things. Actually, there were some studies prior to the ending of colonization, at least in Africa in the 60s, that showed that it had become expensive to run. I mean, from a cost-benefit point of view, it was cheaper to have these colonies as neo-colonies as opposed to as colonies. Just manage them indirectly and manage the economic affairs indirectly. And that is what neo-colonialism is. And that is what we've been battling with in Africa since the 60s. So, for example, you find that our financial systems are very much dependent on the West. That's neo-colonialism. We're very much dependent on on ostensible global institutions, but that are effectively run at the advantage of the West. So we're very much dependent on the IMF, on the World Bank, on the World Trade Organization. That in itself is neo-colonialism at play. So this is neo-colonialism as theorized by Nkrumah. And the audience, it's an excellent book. In many ways, that book led to him being overthrown in 1966, the following year, because it was such a cogent, for the first time, it was able to bring to the fore exactly what was happening in the background.
Yeah. I want to just kind of like try and see if you agree that we also have, over the years, do get some agency, because when the continent came into independence, most of this, systems were already set up, right? So it was asked to come in and plug in into that existing system, but our development has not been, as the example you gave, for example, of that of China. The first time I traveled to, because when we were in school, we learned about the Asian tigers. The first time I traveled into those countries, I was very surprised to see what, in reality, what that theory was. That these countries were able to develop despite, having this existing global system, including China, which when I was born, China's GDP per capita was lower than that of Chad. Which is a mind-boggling statistic to think about. So if they were able to do it within this global system that already existed, because countries like India as well got independence because it became too expensive to continue having them as colonies, but they have been able to grow out of it. So what is holding the African continent back?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fascinating conversation. How is it that other parts of the world tend to have relative agency, whereas in Africa we don't? First of all, many of our countries are still very new, at least as countries, right? Many of them are still very new. My own country, Zambia, is only going to be 60 years old this year. It was turned 60 last year. Against like China, which is like millennia. It's like an old kind of society. So many of our countries are still very new, at least as we think about countries. So that's so the experience of colonization is still very recent. But also the manifestation of neocolonialism has been its most brutal in Africa. I mean, there are very few places where, except for some Latin American countries, and I don't know what the number is, where you've had Western-sponsored coups, man, to the extent that we've had them in Africa, political assassinations to the extent that we've had in Africa. And those are the overt, those are the ones that we can see. but there's a whole lot of machinery in the background, which is what neocolonialism, the theory of neocolonialism, is trying to articulate, that we haven't been privy to, all the attempts at thwarting so the arrival of Africa on the global stage. I think neocolonialism has been its most virulent in Africa, and one may ask the question why. Primarily because of, I think, the natural resources base of the continent. The African continent has been very vital to the creation of the modern world. First of all, with exporting people, which was slavery. Slaves from Africa started the Industrial Revolution, which changed the world in very, very foundational ways. So Africa has been very vital to the sustenance of global capitalism in terms of people initially, subsequently in terms of resources, right? I mean, if you think about a country like Congo, you're effectively asking me the question, why has the Congo been in a permanent state of crisis?
Yeah.
It makes sense because the Congo is arguably one of the richest countries in the world. Africa is one of the richest places in the world. And global capitalism cannot exist without Africa. Essentially, therefore, neocolonialism has been its most brutal in Africa. This is my analysis of it vis-a-vis other parts of the world. What does Asia have? Mostly Asia is not as resource rich as Africa is. Mostly it is people, but not so much in terms of, and people were a resource, at least sort of people in a sort of as a commodity in an earlier iteration of capitalism. But in this iteration of capitalism, the main thing has been these resources, for oil, gold, cobalt, lithium, cocoa, copper, and these things are in a great abundance in Africa. So this is my analysis of it. And now there's some blame on our part because
I was going to ask.
Because, that's true.
The external factor may be the main factor. What are the internal factors? Because there's always this question of governance and corruption and efficiency. Have we done enough on the internal factors yet?
That's a good question, Sam. So I think the internal factors, I think the big thing has been the absence of a cogent theorization of what I just articulated before. Right? This inability for elites to grasp essentially what I just articulated and before, and to turn it into a program of action of how you push back against neocolonialism. Because there's been an absence of that sort of rich ideological, theoretical articulation of the African condition, then there's been like a bit of what one may call a short-circuiting. So there hasn't been a sort of a realistic program of action for Africa because there hasn't been rich theory understanding that this is why you are where you are. The rest of the world wants your stuff. What are you going to do about it, right? There hasn't been this kind of rich theorization of the African condition, which is the opposite in Asia, for example. I mean, for example, when I read China, I read China's history from the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and they already knew. First of all, the Communist Party of China, which established the PRC, were like fighting for 20 years. Like they were fighting for 20 years before they ended up establishing the PRC. And in that process of fighting, they were clarifying ideologically what their program was. They were clarifying ideologically what had been the problem, problematizing it. This is why China has been humiliated. China has had 100 years of humiliation. And this is what we are going to do. Right? So it's a rich ideological understanding, rich theorization, which then translates itself into a program of action. I think this is what we've been unable to do in Africa. And things like corruption are really red herrings. They're really red herrings. Again, these are things which have been theorized by others. Again, this is why theorization matters. Ideas matter. And if the others are very productive, they have successfully theorized the African condition. And therefore now when I ask the typical policy elite or the typical elite in Africa today, the leaders, I ask him, what's the problem in Zambia? Very likely he will say corruption. Oh, we're too corrupt. There's too much corruption. Exactly what do you mean? Corruption in a neo-colonial sense? Because that is the corruption we should be concerned about. The fact that others are really bribing us, or others are really invading our territory to the advantage. That's the corruption we're talking about. But essentially what they're talking about is petty corruption, petty bribes, which exist everywhere else. New York City, somebody told me the level of corruption that takes place in the New York City, in the city of New York is mind-boggling. But when somebody tries to, has that held New York City back? No, right? So exactly. So I apologize. It's all over the place, but this is my understanding of the problem, that we have not effectively, since Nkrumah, for example, since Nkrumah's neocolonialism, 1965, there hasn't been a rich set of contributions, additions. Some have tried. A few African thinkers have tried. Cabral has tried, to add to that armor, but not a lot. So it hasn't been a serious program of study, a program of, Samir Amin may have done so, Kandawira may have done so, but there hasn't been, this active theorization, making it cogent, making it clear, so that the mass of our people can be able to understand the African condition and therefore translate that into a program of action. We haven't done that, honestly. So that's the main output on us. But not so much this other stuff of corruption, lack of democracy, lack of good governance, accountability, transparency, all these buzzwords that we that we are sorted with on a regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, on that, like when we had our little conversation last time, kind of both agreed that words or definitions can mean whatever they want when you want them to mean what you want. So
that's true.
We live in a world where we're seeing things changing so drastically. It's very interesting to see how that is changing. But as you were talking about, like China and how they're able to emancipate themselves, the one I think maybe is lacking on the continent, because we see it in European Union. It's a big bloc. They have agency as a big GDP. The US by itself is big. China, India have the population. Africa's question seems to be very fragmented by countries that were, created out not because of our own will, except Ethiopia. I can proudly say. But there's that defragmentation of the continent that doesn't give it the power that a large population would have, like China or India or the European Union. So how do you solve for that when you're small pieces?
Yeah, by the way, this balkanization of the continent, insofar as articulating a common position, is itself neocolonialism. And there was an active debate just after independence in the 60s. I think there was a Monrovia group and the Casablanca group, I forget now, but there was a debate about, Nkrumah's idea about a united Africa. This effectively, it was very serious. One army, large common market, all these things which now have taken on neoliberal clothing. But he really meant it as a political project. One army, one market, one currency, all these kinds of things. And that was thwarted, and I, not as a matter of principle, not that there were good theoretical reasons argued that were marshaled to challenge Nkrumah's calling for united Africa. But I think it was neocolonialism. Just some people were sponsored to cause confusion because it works, divide and conquer. Like you said, Sam, there's 1.4 billion of us, in excess of 1.3 billion of us, or 1.2 billion of us, quite almost like the population of China, population of India. Our GDP is, if we combine, is about in excess of $3 trillion. So we wouldn't be as, if we could articulate a common African position, we would be a force to reckon with. A complete force, but just by sheer numbers of population and the economy. But we don't do that. We like to very on the surface of it, so Pan-Africanism, Africans, we're Africans, but there's nothing deep beyond just this on the surface, chanting chants of Pan-Africanism. Whereas the Europeans, on the other hand, You never really hear them say pan-Europeanists. No, but they work as a bloc, a very effective group. And you've seen now with the emergence of Trump how they've been working as a bloc in trying to articulate a counter position to Trumpism. So this is, for us, this is the challenge. Like it is impossible for Zambia with 20 million people with a GDP of 20 billion or 30 billion dollars to be able to assert itself on the global stage. It will never happen in our lifetime, my lifetime, and maybe even in my children's lifetime. It is impossible.
I was about to ask you how pragmatic this assessment of trying to unite the continent is in itself, or how optimistic you yourself are. Because knowing African countries and their internal politics and the tribalism that's in there, the question is, like, we're trying to still fight the minor divisions within countries, leave alone having a Pan-African stance as a continent. So I agree with you, it may not happen in our lifetime.
But we've got to hope, man.
We've got to hope. That's all. But kind of like moving to the question of okay, we need to develop. And I guess we can agree the kind of development we need is emancipate. How are you phrasing it? Emancipative?
Emancipatory development. By the way, I've got a chapter. I will share with you. I should have shared with you a recent book that I edited. It's by a series of sort of what one may call the next generation of political economists in Africa. And I've got a chapter in that book where its chapter title is Development as Emancipation. Really essentially making the argument that development really should be emancipatory. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. And we've got to be able to, and then once you articulate development as an emancipatory project, then when you're writing down your development plans, then you ask yourself, where does this lead us to? Foreign direct. So what role should foreign direct investment play in our development process, right? Or how should we mobilize the resources to develop ourselves? Otherwise, if you're not clear on that, then you might very well say, we need Amazon, man. We need Amazon to come here and develop. It will be development, but is it emancipatory? Isn't it? Emancipatory development, son.
But okay, so how do you do it? How do you? What are the resources that we need to have emancipatory development? And I want to mention a couple that are key, but I want us to zoom into the dead ones, because that's the area we're trying to focus. FDI, okay. What else?
So in my estimation, if you're trying to you're striving for emancipatory development, foreign direct investment should play a very minor role. Really, it should be a supplementary role, not the fundamental foundational role, which is essentially how neoliberal development has been sold to us, right? It's okay. Foreign investment, you need foreign investment. So you should be able to mobilize resources either domestically, and this is why it matters to have an African plan for development, as opposed to an Ethiopian plan or a Zambian plan or a Lesotho plan or a Swatini plan. I mean, you've got to have an African plan for development, because then you can mobilize, and the resources are there domestically.
Are they there?
Yeah, they are there. Some in your country's capital, Addis Ababa, there exists an entity called the Economic Commission for Africa. In 2015, they led by the distinguished economist Abdallah Hamdok, they issued a seminar report, which was essentially convened. I think there was a commission convened by Thabo Mbeki, called the High Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows. And they issued a seminar report that said Africa on an annual basis loses something like somewhere between, I don't know, big numbers, man. We don't even know because it's hidden. $50 billion to like $300 billion per annum in illicit outflows.
Yeah.
These are huge amounts of monies, man. Huge amounts of monies. And then, we've just got to be able, we can mobilize domestic resources. By the way, even though we are saying Africa has never really developed in an emancipatory way, There was a period in our history for a couple of years in some African countries where there was an attempt at some level of industrialization, at a level of like homegrown development. And what we find is that much of that was domestically financed. It was domestically financed. It
What
wasn't
are those
financed.
examples?
I mean, if you look, there's an interesting book by Tandeka Mkandawire and Charles Chukuma Soludo from 1999 called African Perspectives on Structural Adjustment. They go in there and they have a series of case studies of countries in Africa that were able to experience very impressive levels of economic growth between 1965 and 1980 or 1975, that 10-year period. High rates of economic growth, high rates of industrialization, high rates of employment generation, high rates of wage growth, also improvements in the social spheres, education, health, and most of that was domestically financed. You know, most of
Yeah,
that
but
was
that has to be during the commodity boom years, right?
Oh yeah, okay. Yes, good. But how is it we have had commodity booms subsequent to that, where we've done nothing? Those commodity booms, and that's the point. So we were able to use which is what we should do. You should leverage the thing that you have. Yeah. So we were able to pretty much leverage those commodity booms, use the savings from those commodity booms to finance industrialization. So we've done it before. We can still do it, but we're bleeding this money. So for me, domestic mobilization of resources as a strategy for emancipatory development is key. Is key. Yeah.
And then I guess the other one that I guess has been in the news for the past since the pre-pandemic is debt. What role does debt, and I'm mainly talking about foreign debt, play in development, in emancipatory development?
That's true. So it depends type of debt and where the debt is coming from, right? I mean, so we have yeah, because it's important. It depends, because often I have seen pushback from some of my friends who are on the front line saying, no to debt, no to debt. Actually, we do need debt to be able to develop, because sometimes, even though I'm making an argument for domestic resource mobilization as a strategy for financing yourselves, sometimes even when you can marshal all the domestic resources, you may not have enough. You know, some projects are very costly. Rarely do I like to quote the African Development Bank, but I'll quote them because on this part, they're right. They've done an estimate, for example, of the power problem in Africa, the electricity problem. You know, some we have a major electricity problem.
Yeah.
Many of our countries have blackouts on a daily basis. So how are you going to industrialize, man, if you don't have reliable power, cheap power, and all that stuff? Yeah. So they've done an estimate just of how much investments have to happen on an annual basis to be able to plug this power deficit. I mean, the numbers are huge. They're talking about $100 billion per annum for the next, I don't know how many years. So even if we could grab all that money that UNECA estimated for us was being spirited away, we would still have some deficit. So we need to borrow, in a sense. Now, the problem we've had in Africa is that we've been borrowing from the wrong type of borrowers. We've been borrowing the wrong type of debt at very high interest rates and not even borrowing from each other, right? I mean, it is, you know, if one had to do it properly, there are some countries that sometimes are surplus countries. There are some countries at times that are deficit countries and vice versa. And we could, if we could coordinate it on the Pan-African level, we could be able to borrow and lend from each other, lend to each other. So debt in principle should not be a bad thing, but it's a type of debt, the terms of the debt, where the debt comes from. For us, much of our debt has been coming from the West. Our debt has been coming from the IMF. And that has been an entry point into neocolonialism. That's the issue. It has just been the entry point in neocolonialism. It is not the debt. The IMF doesn't care about the debt. The Western lenders don't care about the debt, but it's what the debt can do in trying to control you, which is where the action is. That's where the action is. If we control you, you know, then we can ask you to, oh, you guys are now in trouble. You have a crisis. You can't pay. And also because we haven't been able to articulate a very clear theory, we haven't been able to improve on Nkrumah's neocolonialism. Our elites fall prey to this. You know, you've borrowed therefore you've got to pay. And then we say, okay, we now we now try to bend backwards to pay, and nobody ever wants to say, oh, we can't pay. We can't pay. Let's see what you'll do. All of us refuse to pay. Let's see what you do. So we never do those kinds of things. So because our elites are very unimaginative, we're falling backwards to try to pay this debt. And in this attempt to pay this debt, we're then left with open ourselves up to all sorts of interference, all sorts of crazy policies, man. Like in Zambia, for example, in our most recent discussions with the IMF, we were asked to do some things that were anti-development, completely anti-development, reduce on subsidies to food. Even though that program to subsidize food production has been one of the most successful in my estimation over the last 3 decades. Reduce subsidization of education, healthcare, of electricity, these kinds of very nonsensical things which they would never do themselves. So it is that allows that kind of entry point.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you have an IMF program coming in, what else is coming, and we've seen it in across the continent where they have programs. It's the same: reduce your subsidies on the key things that we'll get into education and healthcare, and then increase costs of people.
If I may, Sam, if I may, just a little bit, why would they have the same prescription for 54 countries? Like, honestly, it tells you what's going on here. Why would they have these countries are so different? They're so heterogeneous. Why would you have the same prescription? But it only makes sense if you understand the mission, right? The mission is really to cripple the continent. Therefore, they have the same prescription.
Wait, do you believe that the whole, the mission for any of the debt restructuring or the programs that they come with is to cripple the economy when they come in?
Yeah, because they're anti-development. If they're asking you to stop subsidizing to stop making investments in the things that lead to development, honestly, then what are they after? And also, like in the case of Zambia, we've had, my last count, I think was 17 or so programs with the IMF since 1972. And each program was sold as the program that will permanently resolve Zambia's problems. So I mean, honestly, Sam, you tell me, if somebody's telling you to, if I'm your helper, I say I'm coming to help you, man. I'm telling you, don't read. I'm telling you, don't go to school. Don't look after your healthcare. Don't take your vitamins. Don't take your medicine when you're sick. What am I after, man? What really am I after? I want to cripple you.
I mean, so I guess the other argument would be, if they're theorizing it, say, okay, we're looking at this nation, this GDP, this economy on paper, and it seems like you're wasting a lot of money on this on the right side, while you do not have enough coming in on the left side. So for our program to work, we need you to stop spending money on the right side, which is on education and healthcare and food subsidies and fuel subsidies. And we need you to mobilize more resource mobilization, revenue collection, by taxing more, all those things. So on paper, which I guess would be a naive way to approach it, but that's how they come in and say, we need you to increase this side and reduce this side.
Yeah, except even on the increasing side, by the way, if you look at the increased taxation, and they always talk about it, they'll always talk about you need to increase the rate of tax collection. And then you see the prescriptions, they're essentially the big elephant in the room, which are the natural resources sector, which is what we have now as the resource we can leverage. You find that taxation to that sector, which is often owned by Western multinational companies, is never discussed. They often will say, oh, collect more taxes on I don't know, mobile I don't know, like things which are like mobile financial services, collect more taxes on the informal market. These are the kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that they're telling us to do, when the action is actually on the other side, in this big elephant in the room. The Western multinational companies, they never talk about that. I mean, for example, the finance bill that was rejected in Kenya last year, they were asking for more tax collection. Oh, good thing. Except when you see what they're really advising, essentially forcing the Kenyan government to do, is to tax, things that are good, that are useful for the working class. Again, crippling the working class of Kenya. But at the expense of the. So I'm afraid, Sam, if you, whichever way you try to skin this, I don't say skin the cat because that's not, the way you try to skin this situation, whichever way you try to sort of analyze it, it leads to this position, man. For me, it leads to the position that, oh my God, down with the IMF, honestly.
On
Get
the question of Kenya,
yeah,
okay, we're gonna hashtag that because
yeah,
they did hashtag that in Kenya. They said saying no more to IMF in Kenya, and that's why they
yeah,
went on the protest. But the Kenyan population is a bit different than say DRC or
yeah,
they have more agency to come out and protest, which led
yeah,
to changes.
yeah,
And in subsequent programs in Ethiopia, I saw that they had put a caveat saying just in case the same population comes out and protests, you need to have a plan set up for it. So
yeah.
so they know that they know what may happen or may not happen. But again, I guess the question again, if I may be the devil advocate again, is are they not plugging in a need that's there? Because we agree that there needs to be some resource that is available for this development, even if which may include the repayment of your existing debt and the interest. You need the money, and they're the ones who are availing it.
No, they're just confusing us. To be honest, no, there's no. I don't see what need do they serve? I don't see a need for them.
Why
And
why
if
do why do our
something,
governments then accept to have those programs?
yeah, that's true. I mean, so part of it is a whole set of conversation we can have about why, for some reason, our governments always take their begging balls to Washington. Part of it is many of our ministers of finance are alumni of the IMF. I don't know who's the minister of finance in Ethiopia, but I wouldn't be surprised if he has had a stint in the IMF. The
Ahmed
same
Shide,
thing.
the central
I'll be.
governor was at IMF.
Say it again.
The central governor Mamo was
Yeah,
at that.
I wouldn't be surprised. I'm sure even your Minister of Finance has had some type of stint. The same, I don't know about in Kenya, the one who was fired by Ruto as a result of the finance bill protests, was in Njuguna, I think is his name. He was at the IMF, or at least in those circles, or at this World Bank circles. And Njoroge, who was the former central bank governor, was the World Bank. In Zambia, the Minister of Finance, Msokotwane, was at the IMF. Is an IMF alumni of some sort. Central bank governor was at the World Bank. So again, so they have, you see, our friends, think about it, or our cripplers, they really have a grand strategy, man. They have a grand strategy, right? We don't. Even in Senegal, where we were hoping that, oh, there was a new president, he seemed to have been saying the right things as a candidate. And then I just saw Minister of Finance, oh, IMF alumni. Then I just, oh, there goes that. So this essentially is one of the ways in which, it's a question, why do we always keep taking ourselves back? That's part of the reason why they have this alumni. The other part is, like you said, very few mass mobilization of the people to fight this. And even in Kenya, admirable as it is, but I suspect it's once off. They will try to tweak some things on the edges, but a couple of years from now, we'll be back to square one, man. So this has to be sustained mobilization. And sustained mobilization only works if we have a theory. We have to have our intellectuals, man, be able to produce accessible information, real distilled understandings of why this is happening, mass education of our people so that our people can keep demanding to their governments, no to the IMF. We reject your unimaginative solution. Go back and imagine a better solution for us. We
Do you have
reject
any
the appointment
examples? Do you have any examples of countries that have done that and can
that
be
have developed without the IMF. China, man.
no, on the continent in sub-Saharan Africa? In fact, I'm even leaving Morocco out of it.
I mean, so in like that 10-year period I talked about, this was the absence of IMF. There was no IMF there. I think many of our countries began to interact in the IMF in the late 70s. I think Senegal was one of the first ones, at least in terms of structural adjustment. And then it's been downhill ever since then. So yeah, we have this campaign. I mean, currently it's very difficult because their tentacles are everywhere. But for example, in the Sahelian states, with this new generation of leaders there are some interesting experiments. But even there, we're beginning to see the blowback, man. I mean, we're beginning to see the pushback. I don't know. I just saw on the BBC the other day that Ibrahim Traore has survived his, I don't know if it's 18th coup attempt. What's going on there? There were 18 coup attempts, man. But you can easily see how neocolonialism works. We haven't properly grasped as a people. Again, this is why I keep saying we keep thinking it's all conspiracy theories, because we haven't really developed clear theoretical scaffolding, improving on Nkrumah's seminal contribution on its neocolonialism. This, for me, is Africa's problem.
I know you said we should probably come together as a continent and say, sorry, we're not paying, and then see what happens.
Yeah.
We have Argentina that keeps doing it, and it still keeps coming back.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw the news now. They're actually asking for a chunk of the money to be given beforehand instead of in like long-term installments. So if Argentina can do that, I know you've suggested some similar kind of arrangements for the continent.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. By the way, Argentina keeps defaulting, man, but the sky doesn't fall on them. That's the thing. We are just so obsessed with we're so scared of not paying. And part of it is we haven't theorized. I've just got to plug in my computer. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. I do beg your pardon, Sam. Part of it is that we haven't, again, we haven't really theorized the African condition well enough. Part of it is, again, we have an alumni, the IMF working in our ministries. I mean, when Zambia's Minister of Finance was appointed in 2021, his first thing was, first couple of words that came out of his mouth after saying thank you to the president for the appointment was, we are now going to engage the IMF. It's like, what this guy? What about engage your people? What about engage your people, man? What about engage the unions? Actually, his first person who visited him in the office was the IMF resident representative. And I thought, no, the first people who should have visited you, or who you should have visited, are the youth, or the working people, and that kind of thing. So this is the problem we have. Yeah, so we should do this. Sankara asked us to do this in '87. I remember if you watch that clip from that OAU meeting in Addis in '87, when he says it, everybody laughs in the audience. His fellow leaders. So guys, let's do it together. If I do it alone, I won't be here next time. And they all laugh. And a couple of months later, he was gone. So again, this is neocolonialism, man. You've got to really.
Yeah. But, like when you're saying, when your new finance minister came in, like the biggest crisis that he was facing was because
debt.
You get defaulted on your debt.
Yeah.
So we need to get this thing sorted, which took longer than it should have.
Yeah.
I mean, the Ethiopian one is still going on. Ghana is having its issues, and it has made everybody else stay away from any of these plans that the G20 and came up with. So even the solutions that were presented for the few countries that said, "Hey, okay, we're Argentina, we can't pay. It doesn't make any sense." The solutions that were presented put them into deeper holes than if they had tried to pay the debt.
That's true.
So how do you solve for that?
Yeah, I mean, again, we have to be imaginative. And number one is to take the IMF out of the kitchen. They're just the ones who are distracting us and constraining our ability to even imagine a different world. If a minister of finance,
I think that's politically possible in the current day and age. I know that, in fact, the US wants to reimagine this global multilaterals, which may be an advantage for Africa. But as it is currently, is it possible to disengage and say, we don't want anything to do with IMF, we don't want anything to do with the World Bank, Just leave us alone.
Imagine if we had asked, if somebody had posed this question to our foremothers and fathers, man, in the run after political independence. Is it possible to imagine a country without the British, without the colonial governor administering our affairs? I mean, we would, exactly. And that's the thing. You've got to. You have no other choice but to imagine a different world. And I think in our case, we have been very unimaginative. Part of it is, again, go back to this business of our intellectuals haven't done a very good job of really articulating cogently an alternative. I think a lot of intellectuals in the run-up to political decolonization were doing a lot of good work. Fanon, the list is endless. Nkrumah himself, many of the first presidents had written a philosophy of political independence, why it mattered, to imagine that you've got to do self-determination, at least in the level of politics. So, Sam, we've got to. But yeah, we've got to, and we have no other choice, man. We've got to. It is possible. Others have done it. Others have done it without the IMF. We should be able to do it. But we are so distracted. It's so sad. It is incredibly sad. And for example, I've not had any access to the Ministry of Finance in Zambia, even though I try. You would think maybe, I'm an economist, I'm Zambian. You would think in the process of trying to get to a solution, say, okay, let's invite everybody we can invite on the table to have a discussion. But that doesn't even happen. That's just the level of unimaginativeness that we have among us, the elite, that they're not even willing. They're afraid to just be able to have just a conversation about how things can be done differently. And here we are. Yeah.
So where do you suggest we get, or do we not have any external influence in the development in terms of resources? Because we do take in a lot of bilateral trade, bilateral debt. And India is there, China is there, some individual countries come in. Well, I mean, I guess it goes back to what you were saying earlier. It's not just that we need to have debt. It's what are you going to do with the debt, right? It's what kind of development you're going to do with it.
Yeah, that's
but when
what
it comes
kind of
to
debt.
that kind of what kind of debt is key. So if that is the key thing, then even if you're having multilateral debt, and if you're putting it in something that's going to not only just pay for itself, but lead to emancipatory development.
Correct.
Even though we may argue that the agenda that it's coming in with may be wrong, it's up to you to negotiate what the deal is, right? Because we get IMF deals when you are put in a corner, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I'll answer this question. That's an important point about different types of debts. One of the interesting things about debt from China has been that an argument can be made that what this debt has financed in general, now there are exceptions where the numbers look problematic, but in general, it is the kind of what it has financed will lead us somewhere along this path of emancipatory development, because what it has financed is infrastructure in many parts of our continent. Not enough, but it has taken us somewhere. That's the kind of debt, if we're going to get into debt, that's the kind of debt we need to get a lot more of, but be also very careful about how we negotiate the terms and all these kinds of things. And that's also why there's been a lot of anti-China rhetoric or anti-China fear-mongering in the West, because again, there's this realization that, if China keeps doing this, these Africans will eventually rise and they'll no longer be our lackeys. So I think, so that's an interesting example. I think more of that type of debt. Obviously, in the long term, less debt, less external debt, much more internal debt, because we also need to develop local debt markets, because we need our people to invest, to save, to have pensions, all these kinds of things. So in the long term, less external debt, but now we do need some aspect of external debt for the reasons that I just gave earlier, but it has to be the right kind of debt That's financing the right kind of stuff. You can't be borrowing, for example, for 10 years. You are borrowing for 10 years to be able to build a port or a bridge or a highway or a hospital or a power station. And you expect that you'll be able to pay it back within 10 years. It's just crazy, man. It's more long-term borrowing and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. I know I had a few other things that, we would have talked about for another 4 hours, currency issues, devaluation, and all those. But this has been good. Really do appreciate it. And I'll keep looking out for your Substack and more of your work that you put out. Wish you all the best.
Thanks, Sam. I enjoyed it, and I'm happy for us to do this again at some other time. And I think this conversation in a very interesting way, and that's what happens when you have a great conversation. It allowed me to clarify a couple of things also in my own head, things that I should be able to write about in the future. So I really appreciate this. Yeah.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I know we delved really deep into some very touchy areas, but it's good to have these conversations and have a starting point for where we believe that the African continent can go and into an emancipated development, as Professor Chelwa said. If you have any questions, or if you want to just reach out for any other interesting reason, including suggesting potential guests on this platform, please reach out to me. I am available on LinkedIn as Samuel Gebre, or on X at Habesha_. Thank you, and bye-bye.